Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Before we begin this session, I would first of all very much like to introduce to you Catherine Ewart, who's going to say a few words. Catherine is the Head of Public Affairs at the Science, Technology and Facilities Council, one of the research councils in the UK that funds scientific research. But they're also very keen to engage and encourage discussion about science and its role in society. And so we're delighted that they're the science champion of the festival this year and supporting all the science debates at the festival. So, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony. As Tony's already said, my role as head of, it's actually head of corporate communications, but don't worry about that, is to raise the profile of STFC amongst our key stakeholders. I'm actually a scientist by background, so I have a great interest in what's going on today. But my main interest in my role is communicating the benefits of science, challenging misconceptions about science, and ensuring that science actually becomes a mainstream part of popular culture. It's great to see so many people here willing to give up a Sunday morning to actually talk about science and to participate in the debate. I just want to say a little bit about STFC because we're actually a young organisation formed in April this year from a merger of two other research councils. We're one of Europe's largest research organisations, and we fund world-class research into astronomy, particle physics, space science and nuclear physics, as well as providing researchers in other disciplines access to world-class research facilities in the UK and overseas. And we have partnerships, international partnerships with the likes of CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory based in Geneva. And if you stick around to the end of today to listen to Brian Cox, he'll be able to tell you an awful lot more about the groundbreaking science that's going on there. We also partner with the ESA, the European Space Agency, and many others. If you'd like to know more about STFC, we actually have a stand upstairs, and there's a model there of Atlas, which is one of the experiments we're currently supporting, looking into the laws of physics. We've been involved in the Battle of Ideas for 3 years as STFC and a predecessor council, PPART. We think this is a unique event. It provides a forum for debate and swapping ideas. And world-class science and innovation doesn't happen just by somebody having a eureka moment, but through engaging with people who think outside the box, ask questions, like the people in this audience today. The most successful long-term science collaborations, whether they're in business or other aspects, are really built on person-to-person connections, and that's why we're supporting the Battle of Ideas today. At STFC, we want to generate a culture in which new ideas can flourish, which is why we're delighted to support these debates. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of today's debates, the science and politics of climate change. Tony.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Okay, so I shall be very brief so we can get on with the debate. I'm going to hardly introduce our speakers at all. They're extremely eminent and well qualified. You can read about them on the website because I don't want to delay things. I would like just to say just a couple of words about the strand of science debates today and this debate in particular. We wrote rather provocatively on the website the following words. Science today arguably plays a role occupied by theology in earlier societies, not as a belief system, but as a source of authority. Just as the secular powers once sought to associate themselves with the church, today's politicians look to science to provide them with the stamp of authority. Science is invoked as the last word on everything from climate change to nutrition, parenting, and even criminal justice. Is this good for science? Is this good for society? These are the sorts of questions we're here to debate today. I, as somebody who extremely enthusiastic about the benefits of science and get very cross when I think that they're being unnecessarily held up by risk-averse and precautious climate, find myself in a difficult position. On the one hand, I wish to respect what science has to say. On the other hand, I find myself concerned that science is being used by some to tell us what we should do, that any rational thinking person, once having heard the evidence, could only make really one sensible choice. And this is a concern that I have, which I think we're here to address in this debate in relation to climate change. So we're here to ask, what does science tell us about how we should respond to climate change? Are scientists becoming involved in campaigning for particular political responses? And if so, is this a good or a bad thing? Is the time for debate really over, or are political choices being obscured by talk of scientific consensus? Are the threats so great and the science so certain that there really is only one course of action? These are difficult questions, and questions I think that people find uncomfortable debating, but I think at the battle of ideas we have created the spirit of free speech is allowed, sensible, intelligent, robust exchange of views is allowed, and that's what's going to happen. So without further ado, our speakers. First to speak, on my far left, is Professor Mike Hulme. Mike is the Professor of Climate Change at the University of East Anglia and the founding director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, one of the most significant research organisations on the issue in the United Kingdom and hugely respected around the world. Following Mike would be Professor Chris Rapley. Have I pronounced that correctly? Good. Chris is formerly the director of the British Antarctic Survey, a wonderful survey that's hugely respected in the scientific community and beyond, and has spoken out on a number of occasions about the climate change issue. I think you said you were described by the Daily Mail as a eugenicist and a hypocrite and something else all in one breath. I can't remember what the something else was, but he's clearly a controversial figure and certainly got the backup of the Daily Mail. So welcome to Chris, who is now, I must say, the director of the Science Museum, a wonderful facility down the road. Third to speak will be Hans von Storch on my immediate left. Hans, as you may guess from his surname, is from Germany. He's there. He is the director of the Institute for Coastal Research at the GKSS Research Centre, and he's also the professor at the Meteorological Institute at the University of Hamburg. And finally, we have Joe Kaplinsky on my far right, who is a science writer. Any of you who read Spiked Online, which is one of our media partners, Joe's written widely on all sorts of issues relating to energy and the environment, and particularly in relation to climate change, about what he has called the growth of scientism. So we'll find out more about what he means by scientism and his thoughts on that debate. Okay, without further ado, please, Mike.
Thank you, Tony. Well, 10 days ago, something quite remarkable happened. The Nobel Committee awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and to Al Gore.
Right, please.
It generated a tremendous amount of commentary, both inside and outside science, both inside and outside the media. And it generated quite powerful responses. I noticed on the BBC News Have Your Say response, it generated the highest number of responses to a news item they had posted there than any other single item. I just want to draw attention to an implicit, what I think was an implicit formula that was revealed by that award. And that formula is that good science plus good communication equals peace. And in climate change terms, peace, I suspect, we have to read as reducing the risks caused by climate change. But to me, it seemed implicit that good science, as represented by the IPCC, plus good communication, as represented by Al Gore, will deliver peace on Earth. Earlier this year, the IPCC reported its fourth assessment report. And the headline in the Guardian newspaper, the day after the Science Working Group reported, said this. It said, the United Nations vast report will end the scientific argument. Now will the world act. So both of these two reflections, the award of the Nobel Peace Prize and the way in which the Guardian newspaper interpreted the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report, seems to me, both of them seem to me to display a very poor understanding of how the world works. Also, a very poor understanding of actually what science can do for us. It's not a case that we will have the scientific debate, then once we agree what the scientific evidence is, we simply then have to communicate it, peace will break out, the world will act, and the problem will be solved. That is not what science's role is. It is not the way that most public political issues are resolved. and it certainly is not the way in which climate change is going to be tackled. Science is only the beginning. Communication, awareness raising, which I think is what Al Gore was awarded it for, is only the beginning. The real issues are about why we disagree about what to do about climate change. And science cannot provide us with the script that we all read from. So I just want to illustrate that basic thesis of mine with three observations about how science is in danger of, or at least is perceived to be, overreaching its legitimate role. One is around the question of what is dangerous climate change. The predominant number, if you ask people, both in science and in policy, is that 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. We've already had 0.7 or 0.8, but 2 degrees is what constitutes dangerous climate change. This a magazine advertising campaign from Christian Aid, do you recognise that? If you can see it, just came out in the last few months. Christian Aid urge UK citizens to write to MPs in relation to the climate change bill that it should set in target an 80% reduction by 2050. But the point here is they say scientists have agreed that the Earth must not exceed an average temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius, otherwise catastrophic climate change will be unavoidable. Have scientists agreed that? Is it actually the role of scientists to agree what is dangerous and what is not? 0 degrees of global warming is dangerous for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people on this planet. In other words, climate is dangerous, let alone climate change. So saying that 2 degrees of warming is dangerous is actually rather insulting to the many hundreds of millions or billions of people who find climate risks not manageable at the moment. 2 degrees, on the other hand, is safe. Certainly it's safe for me. I live in a comfortable detached house halfway up a hill in Norwich with a lot of money, social capital and mobility. 2 degrees of global warming is not dangerous for me. My point simply is that science can contribute to debates about what constitutes danger, but it is not, quote, for scientists to tell the world what is dangerous. The second example is from the Stern Review last year. The headline report in the Stern Review on the economics of climate change said that unmitigated climate change will cause between 5 and 20% loss to global wealth, global GDP. Used classical economic arguments plus 1 or 2 extras to come up with that figure. I simply suggest that that is an incomplete and rather inadequate way of approaching climate change. The Stern Review said nothing about what the value of climate is. All it was trying to do was to say, what is the potential economic loss of climate change? What is the value to cultures and societies and individuals around the world simply of climate? No economist has actually tried to tackle that question. And thirdly, and this again is where science gets entangled, I think wrongly, is that the Kyoto Protocol, again, is not a political response to climate change that you can read from a scientific script. As Steve Rayner and Gwyn Prinz pointed out this week in the journal Nature, the Kyoto Protocol is not the only game in town. In fact, their argument, which I largely agree with, is that the Kyoto Protocol has failed, it's a bad investment, and we should cut our losses and actually try to recast our political and policy response in a completely different way. So those are my points that I open with, Tony. I think that there's a real danger that we have confounded science's role, true role, with an inappropriate role in relation to climate change. We've constructed a very rigid, monolithic problem, climate change, with a very rigid and single-minded solution, the Kyoto Protocol, and we actually need to go back several stages, reform the problem, and rethink the solutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Very clear comments there to get us started. Chris, your turn.
Thank you. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and firstly put climate change in the context in which I've grown to see it over 20 or 30 years of being involved with this story. And I see it as a symptom of a different issue, which is the issue of human use of energy. And so just very briefly, about 100 million years ago, there was an unusual period in the Earth's climate history where carbon-based vegetation got trapped at the bottom of the ocean, and after a series of geological and biological and chemical processes, a certain amount of oil was generated. Now, coal and gas were generated, coal by similar but separate processes. And about 150 years ago, when the human population was a billion or so, and life on the whole was pretty hard, and most of the human energy supply was either from wind, water, or beasts of burden, including other humans, humans began to discover the presence of this condensed, liquid, hugely transportable and fantastic substance. And since then, there's a wonderful, I've forgotten who the quote comes from, but there is a quote I always remember: all progress results from the ineluctable desire of every organism to live beyond its means. And that's essentially what we've been doing. We've found that this supply of oil has been wonderful. It has completely transformed the human condition. All of the benefits of the modern world that we don't share very equitably, but those of us here benefit from, really result from that energy supply. That's great. Wonderful story. And if that were it, we could head on into the future with great optimism. But it's as if we've had a great party and now we're beginning to get the hangover. Because in this complex Earth system, it's difficult to intervene to do only one thing. And so it's difficult to intervene to extract that material, burn it for its energy, and leave it at that. And as we discovered initially with acid rain, and then another issue with the production of what looked like completely innocent and wonderful chemicals, the CFCs, that when we do these things, there are sometimes downstream unexpected consequences. And although the Earth systems work very hard to mop up most of the carbon dioxide that we've popped into the atmosphere, the 500,000 million tons that we've put there in 150 years, about half of it still sits up there with nowhere to go. Now, as a physicist, to me, the greenhouse effect isn't rocket science. People have been working on the consequences of adjusting the greenhouse effect. It's a very beneficial effect. We wouldn't be here if it didn't exist for that time. And so it just, to me, is implausible that the Earth would not respond to this additional carbon. And you can argue about how much it responds, but I'm quite prepared to go along with the fact that the 0.7 degree rise we've seen recently in the climate system, which has moved it out of the bound of natural solar-driven and internally driven variability, shows the fingerprint of human action. Now, let me change gears. I was originally involved in building instruments to fly on satellites to look at the universe, and a fascinating thing it was. It looked at sources of new phenomena that one could see when one finally got instruments above the atmosphere. It was a marvellous, marvellous, marvellous period of time in the 70s and early 80s. But I took a choice when remote sensing, the study of the planet from space, started. I thought it might be more useful as well as interesting, and thereby slightly less indulgent of public support, if I was involved with looking at the Earth. And that was at the time when there were a few people who were saying, you know, if we go on burning fossil fuels like this, there is a chance that we could shift the climate system, and that might be bad news. And really the story of the last 27 years has been the emergence, if you like, of the signal of that human fingerprint, emerging out of the natural variability. And of course, space observations and ground observations have all had their role to play in it. Now, in about 10 years ago, the then Science Minister, William Waldegrave, Margaret Thatcher's Science Minister, laid out in a white paper called Realising Our Potential, for the first time, the expectations of government who are paying for science, the STFC being one of the routes that money flows, the obligations, if you like, on the scientists expected of them. And those included, for the first time, a clear statement that scientists weren't meant to stop when they had done their erudite academic work and published it in the peer-reviewed literature, but they were expected to engage with society on ensuring that that information and any benefits from it flowed to society. And really what we've seen, particularly in the climate change debate over the last couple of years, is a massive increase in that activity. Now, scientists were not trained, increasingly they are, they were not trained to deal with the media, which is a very fickle and difficult medium through which to work. And I fear that what we're seeing now in some of the kickback, if you like, against this issue of science's role in the climate change debate is the aggregate effect of getting some of that communication through the media badly wrong. And I've been somebody who's been involved in this, and I would be the first to confess that there have been things that have gone badly wrong, and things that one would have regretted. Very naive scientists are in understanding what the media are about. Basically, the media are about selling newspapers, selling time on air, and they are often less concerned about the rigour than the science community is. So this is an uncomfortable position for the science community to be in. And it was for that reason that when the Stern report came out, I heard around the science community involved in this a huge sigh of relief, in the sense that there was a feeling, well, thank goodness, we are now handing over responsibility for where to take this issue into society more general, into politics, into economics, into the gatekeepers of society. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not still involved, because as soon as that happens, people say, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? Can you predict what the consequences would be in this complex system? And so there is still a role for science, but finding that balance is still what we're involved in. Now, the last thing I would say is that I have granddaughters, and a little example I've often given is this. As a responsible grandparent, if I walked up to an aeroplane and the stewardess said, welcome aboard, we're happy to take your granddaughter to wherever she's going. By the way, do you realise that there is a 1 in 100 chance that the wings are going to fall off this aircraft on the flight? Well, as a responsible grandparent, I honestly wouldn't put my granddaughter on that aircraft. However, she and I and all of us sitting here are on the planet. And so even if there is only a 1 in 100 chance that our intervention in the climate system with carbon emissions is going to cause serious problems, then I think we have to take that possibility seriously. And what we're trying to do here is cut through the emotion, actually look at the evidence and figure out what the options are in a sort of risk register way. All major organisations have a risk register where they look at the probability of something happening, the impact of something happening, and the capacity they have to manage it. And they focus their attention on things that sit high on their risk register. For me, in my judgment, climate change through our profligate use of carbon-based energy is high on the risk register. Ergo, we need to discuss what we're going to do about it. And we're all in this together, and we have to discuss together how to get out of this fix. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Good stuff. Okay, Hans, your turn, please.
I hope you understand that I'm a foreigner, and you allow me to read my introductory statement, even though it may not be entirely in the way you do these things. So first I should possibly introduce myself, and my name is Hans von Storch. I'm in climate science since 1976. My background is physics and mathematics. My methodical field is climate modeling and climate analysis. My specific interests are directed towards the changing climatology of storms and its impacts on marine environment. I'm working together with social and cultural scientists for about 15 years, and presently I'm a director of the Institute of Coastal Research in Germany and a professor at the Meteorological Institute at the University of Hamburg. Now, what I think about climate, with minuscule doubt, I'm convinced that we observe since a few years the effect of elevated greenhouse gas levels on air and sea temperature and related variables, including sea level. I'm strongly convinced that we will see accelerated warming and related effects in the coming decades. I'm not convinced that we can attribute recently changed levels of weather extremes, a part of heat and cold waves, to this anthropogenic change. For some of the extremes, we will see changing conditions in the coming decades to come. I have little doubts that the impact of anthropogenic climate change in the coming decades will represent a formidable challenge to humans and societies, but not a catastrophe. The smaller the changes, the better for humans, societies, and ecosystems. therefore limiting the growth of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. For reducing these challenges is an obvious societal task. I feel considerable uncertainty how anthropogenic climate change has to be ranked as a global problem compared to other challenges, such as poverty and in general the North-South balance. Second, what I think about the division of labor of science and policy making. The purpose of science is to provide understanding of processes, systems, sensitivities, developments, and perspectives. In practical terms, science helps to explain the present and past situations, the driving forces, and the dynamics behind such developments. It points out opportunities and problems. It answers what-if questions. Science offers predictions when possible, otherwise scenarios. Science does not limit the spectrum of options of how to respond to problems. By downplaying options which may be normatively less valuable, and by preferring others which match the normative system of the scientist best. Instead, science informs on all available options, including the caveats. Scientists should limit themselves to their field of expertise when they communicate as scientists to the public. We have a very nice German word on that: scientists are Fachidioten. And this is entirely true. I mean, if we're not Fachidioten, then we are, I'm not sure. Policymakers, on the other hand, are used to take decisions related to high-stake problems with large uncertainties. So this is nothing new for them. They include scientific advice about the expected implications of their decisions, but they factor in also the normative preferences and limits of their constituents and partners. They should not ask science to solve problems, but they should ask for all options and then select that mix which is effective and culturally consistent. If scientists limit the range of the spectrum of options, then they damage the democratic process of policy making and damage the process of science itself. Third, what are the options to respond to the perspective of significant anthropogenic climate change? In principle, we have two, namely to avoid or reduce anthropogenic climate change and or to empower humans and societies to deal with the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. The first, mitigation of climate change, can be achieved by hindering carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to accumulate in the atmosphere. A major way of doing so is to generate, sorry that I say this word, to generate and use energy more efficiently. Of course, you can't generate energy. So that less coal and oil is burned. Another option is to limit the greenhouse gases to enter the atmosphere by using technological measures. A third one is to try to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere by technical measures. Finally, a fourth one is to manipulate the radiative balance of the climate system to counteract the anomaly introduced by the increased levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's the block mitigation. So far in the public, almost exclusively the first option, producing less greenhouse gases, is discussed. Most scientists and policymakers appearing in public strongly support this option. It is, however, already now clear that this strategy will at best limit climate change to, some say, 2 degrees. We spoke about these 2 degrees before, in terms of global mean air temperature. More pessimistic people, including myself, expect higher changes. In any case, under this strategy, we have to expect significant climate changes to emerge in the coming decades. Without a strategy of efficient energy use, considerably higher changes are to be detected. But there will be some. The other 3 mitigation strategies meet great resistance, if not outright tabooing, in the public and with most climate scientists, even if these strategies are discussed in technical circles. The adaptation, on the other hand, is getting little attention in the public arena, even if more and more scientists and decision makers recently admit the need of such research and planning. Since we have already now anthropogenic climate change, and will get more significant climate change, adaptation measures are needed in any case. Investment into more realistic perceptions of risks, investment in knowledge, technology, and implementation of better adaptation to climate risks is win-win, since already now climatic extremes are causing severe damages. But we should be aware of the fact, I think Mike said that already, climate has always been dangerous. It is not so that we will drive with our cars with 160 kilometers an hour on the highway, in Germany, of course. And we stand still nowadays. We now go with 140, and we may go with 160. But some people frame it as if we go with 0 now, and there will be 160. Now, why I'm concerned about the present situation of deliberations. In the present situation, we see alarmists trying to dominate the agenda so that only the dramatic reduction of greenhouse gas generation is offered as, quote-unquote, solutions by scientists and policymakers. In the public, this is paralleled by a debate with only two sides, namely the good caring party, which works to save the planet, and an evil side of so-called skeptics who claim that anthropogenic climate change either does not exist or claim that the present and future man-made change is just marginal. The latter group operates mostly on an amateur level and has hardly anything to offer. However, they are used by the alarmists to maintain that the front line is between responsible pro-activists and irresponsible skeptics. The real debate, however, is between those who take climate change seriously as climate change by examining all options so that policymakers arrive at the best mix of measures to deal with a serious challenge to humankind, and those who use the climate problem as an argument for a broader environmental agenda, who allude that the key to the solution is the individual's willingness to limit personal and overall economic energy use. So I ask policymakers and climate scientists to take the climate change seriously, the issue itself, not as a proxy for a general environmental agenda. Otherwise, the results will be bad policies, inefficient policies, and a compromised social institution, which we need also in the future. This social institution is called science. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. Okay, thanks very much, Hans. Finally, Joe Kaplinsky, please.
Okay, thank you. I think those three useful introductions precede me. I think you can see that there are at least a certain body of scientists who are concerned at the way in which science is taken to dictate the solutions that society should adopt here. But I think we want to take a step back, really, and ask, why is it that society is looking to science in this way? Because I don't think that you can explain it by saying, well, it's kind of bad communication in the way that Chris, for example, suggested might be a kind of contributory factor here. If only the scientists kind of could explain themselves to the media, then this would kind of go away or so forth. And I don't think you can explain it in the way that some people have done to kind of look at a few activist scientists who've kind of made a very high-profile case. Undoubtedly, those kind of campaigning individuals exist. But I think what we really have to look at is the way that any time you hear a kind of politician opening their mouth and talking about science today, what's generally behind that is a serious case of kind of moral cowardice and the desire to avoid really having out an argument about what is good, what is bad, what's the right choice to make in a situation, what's the wrong choice to make in a situation. So I'll come back and give some examples of what I mean in the climate discussion in a moment. But I think it's worth giving just one brief example of the way this is kind of a slightly broader phenomenon than something that's just going on in climate science. So you can see this week there was an example of magistrate Andrew McClintock who asked to be excused of cases where he might have to make a ruling that a child could be adopted by a gay couple. And this was motivated by his Christian belief. And what you found when he lost that case is he appealed and he said, well, and you heard his lawyer making the case very forcefully in the media, the real thing that hasn't been considered here is the scientific evidence that shows that children who are brought up by a gay couple are really going to do less well. And this is the real heart of the matter, and we should kind of set aside his Christian beliefs and so on, and kind of focus on this scientific evidence. And you find this kind of time and time again today. There's this hiding behind the science, and rather than kind of arguing out which choice is correct, there's a sense, well, actually, we have no choice. We're not going to take responsibility for elevating this choice and saying it's correct. Rather, we're going to refer ourselves to the facts of how the world is and kind of make decisions that way. It becomes much easier than taking responsibility for these sorts of things. And I think then when you begin to look not just at the way that science is used as this front, I think that begins to make sense of the way in which, as I think Hans was indicating, this much wider kind of environmental agenda seems to attach itself to the climate change issue. The whole kind of morality around the eco-lifestyle, in the sense that really what the facts of climate change means is that we all need to become eco-warriors. So if you look, for example, at the challenge to the distribution of Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth to British schools, I think it's informative, again, of the way in which things are unhelpfully posed as scientific, because you can see that the parent in that case, kind of Stuart Dimmock, was kind of upset about this. He kind of objected, and I think his kind of lawyer made a very useful point that Al Gore's film was 50% science, 20% politics, and 30% sentimental mush. And you know, you can tell that, you know, Dimmock and all the other parents who got behind him, what they were really objecting to, I'm sure the majority of them, is more the politics and the sentimental mush than the science. But what you found is you got this kind of judgment from Justice Burton that says, well, you know, Al Gore, he departed from the IPCC consensus on the fact of what's causing the melting of Kilimanjaro's glaciers and something like this, right? Now, I'm sure that Dimmock or anyone else was not motivated to kind of go to court because they were worried about this kind of minor error in the geography curriculum, you know. Yet, because science has become the only acceptable language, or if not the only, the kind of leading acceptable language with which we can accept things, you get this kind of proxy debate played out where everybody is kind of forced to kind of argue this out around the science, kind of very profoundly unhelpful way. And I mean, I think that, you know, here you can kind of place some responsibility with leading environmental campaigners and politicians in terms of kind of setting this agenda. So, you know, you can see Al Gore. I don't think I've got time to kind of quote all his sentimental mush and kind of politics and all the rest. I can kind of do that, but he's more or less saying unless you kind of bring your kids up as eco-warriors, then you might as well kind of send them off to the kind of Hitler Youth or something. And then you kind of look at what's his justification for this. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, he talks about the Second World War, Hitler, and, you know, what are your children going to kind of say to you and all this stuff. And you look at the justification, and he says, quote, "Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you voted for me or not, I very much hope that you will sense my goal is to share with you both my passion for the earth and my deep sense of concern for its fate. It is impossible to feel one without the other when you know all the facts," right? And, you know, when you have this kind of sense of the facts descending on people, and I'm talking about the broad public as much as kind of scientists or people engaged in environmentalism, you know, to me it's entirely understandable the kind of traction that climate skepticism and all the rest has gained, because people feel, well, how else are we supposed to kind of respond to this agenda? And you can see exactly the same thing with the British government's promotion of Al Gore's film. So you look at the announcement that this thing was going to be sent around, and you find the announcement by, well, first of all, you find the announcement by the Education Secretary, Alan Johnson, you know, explicitly saying that influencing the opinions of children is, quote, crucial to developing a long-term view on the environment among the public, right? Which, if you kind of unpack that and look at what all these campaigns are, it's about using the kids, right, to guilt trip the parents, right? So that, you know, they're very, very explicitly kind of saying this is what we're doing, you know. And in the same press release, you have David Miliband, then Environment Secretary, saying, quote, "Debate over the science of climate change is well and truly over," right, and citing the publication of the IPCC report, right, which was published on the same day, and they're kind of using this in this way, right, you can see kind of very clearly how science is kind of used in this way to intimidate people and so forth. So, of course, there's lots to disagree on, and as some people have raised them, I'll go through very briefly a kind of a list of points, more a list than kind of an elaboration, because there's no time. But you can find we can disagree about the precautionary principle, about how we should treat worst-case scenarios, about how we should treat the 1 in 100 chance that Chris raised, about the notion of unknown unknowns and surprises and so forth. We should disagree with the notion that Al Gore put forward, that, well, actually these changes to our lifestyle are not so burdensome because these are things we should all be doing anyway, right? Very kind of peculiar notion, I think. We can disagree about things like what moral weight or what value would we want to give to species extinction? You know, what value do we want to give to nature? We can disagree about what is the best way to deal with problems such as poverty or disease or economic development. You know, is cutting carbon emissions really the kind of way to go on that as the best way? We can disagree about what the solution to reducing CO2 emissions is. Is the best solution a long-term program of investment in R&D to produce new energy technologies? You know, would that be a kind of more productive way than all going round to try and kind of change the light bulbs or pull on another sweater and so forth? And you know, just to kind of hammer home, I think that in the public debate, these things are a lot less open than is perhaps kind of presented here as kind of nice, friendly. Well, you know, these things should be open. Let me end with kind of just a couple of quotations from the peer-reviewed literature and kind of citing the IPCC. Which kind of indicate that if you raise questions that you might have thought were kind of reasonable in the way that I just raised them, you're going to get accused of being a follower of Hitler, a defender of slavery, and mentally ill. Now, as I say, this is not from the eco-campaigners where you'll find stuff even worse. This is from the peer-reviewed literature. So you found the chairman of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, saying of Bjorn Lomborg, who put forward many of the points that I raised, not all of them. He said, where's the difference between Lomborg's view of humans and Hitler's? Right? You can find a paper in one of the leading peer-reviewed journals on climate change, climatic change, a paper published earlier this year by Mark Davidson, entitled Parallels in Reactionary Argumentation in the US Congressional Debates on the Abolition of Slavery and the Kyoto Protocol. Now, if you read it, you find his argument is people were against the abolition of slavery and people are against the Kyoto Protocol, and therefore there's a kind of parallel in the argumentation here, more or less. This is kind of the profound argument, right? You can find Brewer writing in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, very prestigious journal, earlier this year, about proposals for geoengineering, the idea that we could perhaps offset some of the problems of climate change by intervening in the other direction. And Brewer says, in the classic psychological sequence with which humans often face extraordinary and perhaps inevitable danger, denial, anger, bargaining and acceptance, we appear now to be at the bargaining stage, where all kinds of solutions are sought and proposed with new vigour and intensity, right? And, you know, well, to start with, it's not a kind of classic psychological sequence. It's kind of psychobabble that I don't think would appear in that journal in other circumstances. You can go back to kind of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying and so forth, and look at the stages he missed out and so forth. But, you know, here we have, as I say, from the peer-reviewed literature, that's before you get into the kind of public debate, how intense the pressure is on people, and I think we need to kind of address that.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, well, thanks very much to all our panel. There's a lot in there. I want to just ask one question to begin with and then go out to the audience. And I want to lead off with my question to all the panel, really, with Joe's last comment about the intense pressure on people, whether scientists or not scientists, to conform with a particular viewpoint. Now, and I want to refer to something actually that Hans has written previously. Now, Hans, I think, is somebody who has, by people I've met, been misconstrued as a climate skeptic by the odd person who obviously hasn't read what he's written. He's made it very clear in his writing and here today that he's not a climate skeptic. However, he has spoken out before about the intensity of this pressure, and I was particularly drawn to some of the arguments you made in Der Spiegel back in January 2005, where you made the argument that each new claim about the future of our climate and of the planet must just be a little more dramatic than the last. Expression of reservation about climate catastrophe is viewed as unfortunate within the scientific community, since they are seen as harming the worthy cause. And you go on to make, I thought, a very important point. This self-censorship in the minds of scientists ultimately leads to a sort of deafness towards new, surprising insights that compete with our or even contradict the conventional explanatory models. Science is deteriorating into a repair shop for conventional, politically opportune claims. Not only does science become impotent, it also loses its ability to objectively inform the public. I thought these were extremely important and fundamental points that you raised at that point in time, and I think they relate to a lot of comments here. And even Chris has said, we've been naive, we've got it wrong, we need to step back. But I don't see many signs of people stepping back at the moment. Can we just address that particular, there's lots on the table, but that particular concern and issue? Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, because actually I sense and believe I see in the science community an awful lot of stepping back. There are an awful lot of scientists who feel extremely uncomfortable in this debate. And let me just give, first of all, a background to what I'm saying here. My view of science is that there is a sort of ant-like process of thousands of people following their curiosity, being paid for largely by the state, investigating some tiny, tiny specialism of the frontier of knowledge. And a lot of that these days is to do with the state of the planet and how this complex system works. Now, the process of science, the peer review, the challenging, I mean, scientists are natural skeptics, and if they can publish something that demonstrates that Dr. X is wrong, they'll do it, A, because they get an extra publication, and B, because they get one up on him. So, the idea that the science community is all sort of marching along in step, in some conspiracy is completely unrealistic. So the process of science is first of all an area of debate. Somebody comes out with a new measurement, somebody suggests that you might draw down carbon dioxide by having pipes bobbing in the sea, and they immediately get hit by a very strong reaction from people who say, nah, that's never going to work for whatever reason. So there's this whole area of science which is work in progress, where there is a genuine debate to be had amongst scientists, amongst anybody who is interested in the subject and wants to look at the facts and try and figure out what's right and what's wrong. And it often requires a lot of work. Some of these issues are never resolved for various reasons. Some of them are resolved. And when they're resolved, they're pushed into a more central area where, having gone through review, and we can talk about the IPCC, there's a feeling is that as far as we know, we're pretty comfortable with that. Now, there is a big issue of consensus. I think there is a discussion to be had about the issue that Tony raised in his little preamble. But there's a sort of central core where people say, well, unless we're very, very surprised, this is right. This is what we believe. I mean, gravity and other things fit in there. Climate science is a little bit more complicated. Now, how you present the distinction between the stuff you are very, very confident about and the stuff that needs debate is something that the science community is discovering. And the heat and light that are in this subject now, I believe, is causing many scientists, many working scientists to say, I don't want to be part of this. It's all too dangerous. It's all too difficult. I'm going to retreat into my shell. And so areas of science which are as yet unresolved are not being debated in public in the way that I believe that they should be.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. I'm just going to push you on one point before letting everybody else return to this comment. Because you present this difficulty, how do you distinguish between the core and the less certain and engage in debate about that? But there does seem to be a broader process going on. And so just to refer to that, I think this is a very striking example. In Friday newspapers, you may have seen its front page of the Times, the Earth Audit. The speed at which mankind has used the Earth's resources over the past 20 years has put humanity's very survival, and this is a quote, at risk. a study involving 14 scientists has concluded. A study, sorry, for 1,400, excuse me, not 14. 1,400 scientists, excuse me. Now, Hans made a point about scientists not speaking beyond their expertise, but Mark Henderson, the science editor of the Times, makes this point. Prophets of doom are 10 a penny, but this time it is serious. And the reason why this time it is serious is because the review, the comments are not coming from a campaign group with an agenda, but because they come from a review commissioned by the United Nations Environment Programme, completed by 400 scientists, with a further 1,000 scientists who pored over the findings to make sure that no misleading claims were made, just in the same way as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. No misleading claims were made, and we have it on, therefore, good authority that humanity's very survival is at risk. I'm not, it begs the question what the qualification of each of those scientists and then what their expertise is. So there's a bigger process going on here, Chris.
There is, but I'll bet you none of the scientists actually. We've lost to find the headline. The scale of the challenge is huge. We've got to act now. Prophets of doom. I doubt whether you'll find that any of the individual scientists would have been comfortable with whoever the sub-editor was who put that headline on it. The point of newspapers is to sell newspapers.
Well, no, there was obviously a process of the organisation itself putting the report together, promoting it in a certain way, saying certain things. So, I suppose what I'm asking you to address is that you've made, I think, valid and important points about stepping back and considering these difficult questions. But there is a political process which is not generated necessarily by scientists or necessarily by any clear individuals or organisations in particular. There is a political process of presenting scientific findings in a way which says, this is the story, this is the deal, deny it if you wish to be irrational.
Yeah, but I'll guarantee that the scientists involved in this effort were asked, in your area of expertise, can you please look at the latest measurements and tell us what you think is happening with error bars and statistics on them? And I agree with you, there is an aggregate process that ends up with these headlines. And what I was trying to say earlier is the science community is, to some extent, a victim of its own success in that it is seen as a source of information which is of relevance to society, but it's finding it very difficult. I'll give you an example. When I was director of British Antarctic Survey, ITN asked if they could take, or if we could take their team down to the Antarctic to look at melting ice and all of these things. And we said, well, we're comfortable to do that provided you guarantee that you do not add hyperventilating, shrieky headlines onto the pieces that you broadcast. And they agreed that that's what they would do. They would simply show the scientists at work, show what the scientists were measuring, and leave it at that. That was not the way it worked out. And there was a major bust-up when, on the first night, the sub-editors wanted to add, Portsmouth will flood tomorrow. And we said, that's not what we said. And the response at that point was for them to say, well, if that's the way you're going to be, we're going to pull this. We're not going to show any more of it. But at the end of the programme, they got 70 calls from the public saying, that was one of the most interesting pieces that you've shown. So we're trying to find our way.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Hans wants to come in.
I think this is, Chris, you said that before, and that it is essentially that you are a follower of this principle, science speaks truth to power. And the trick is, of course, to say it rightly, and to convey it properly, and that these stupid journalists should understand what you're saying. And if they don't do it, then they're indeed, well, they're either mean or stupid. But I think there's a fundamental misconception about that. I mean, journalists are not, at least the way I understand it, they're not secretaries of scientists who just make a protocol what they said and then print it. But they are an independent democratic institution, and they somehow have to build their own opinion and their own view of all this. And your opinions enter into this. And you're not supposed to tell them you're not allowed to say this and that. I mean, you can be disappointed about that, and I would be disappointed, but essentially it's an independent institution, and science has not to censor these people. On the other hand, I'd like it, of course, to also, if I don't do that, if I get response of that sort, but so for some reason I never get that. Only one case in BBC did it once, which is interesting. But this may be also an English problem. But should be aware of the fact that the link between media and science is not that one is a secretary of the other, but media are an independent thing. And if we speak about this problem of interaction of science in the public arena, it is not so that a teacher is speaking to stupid pupils or so, or students. But there are other mechanisms in the public which we scientists, and I think most of us are the physicists or so here, have no clue about. I mean, as I said before, we are Fachidioten. We have certain simplistic ideas how society is operating, how things are transformed, how social constructions are formed. But we have no idea about that. And indeed, we need this idea. And so what I'm asking for is that we get something like a mandatory advising for physical scientists by social and cultural scientists. So we should learn more about what society is, how we ourselves are part of the society, because society is also influencing us, not in the way we take a certain measurement, but in the way we ask and in the way we accept answers. We are more easily accepting answers that something dramatic is changing than answers which are saying, oh, well, it could be in general or will be. And so we should be aware of that, and so we scientists should reflect more upon our own practice, and that's what we do not do. Instead, we think we are teachers. And I don't think that is very wise.
Okay, thanks. Hans, Mike.
Yeah, I think we do need to put this into a wider context, and there is definitely a challenge for science here in relation to communication and language. I mean, the idea of environmental rhetoric is not new. I mean, it's certainly, you can easily trace back its lineage into the 1960s and Rachel Carson. You actually can trace a much longer genealogy, much further back than that. And I think Tony in his opening comments alluded to, if you go back to the medieval period, it tended to be people in cassocks and robes who tended to use the rhetoric of doom and disaster and catastrophe. So there's an issue here about what is the role of rhetoric? What is the power of language? Scientists generally are not trained in rhetorical speech. Generally speaking, the language of mathematics is claimed to be mathematics, isn't it? And that's not a very rhetorical language. But so actually, what's been happening is that as we've certainly in these areas of environmental science and climate change, as we've been drawn into interacting with a much wider community, we have found ourselves sucked into adopting different linguistic tropes or different styles of rhetoric. So, for example, the whole idea, we've got 10 years to save the planet. Yes, it's a newspaper headline, but you actually do find some scientists heading into that type of rhetorical speech. They don't literally mean that. A scientist doesn't literally mean that, just as the headline writer doesn't. But it's a device that is being used, perhaps rather too unconsciously, in trying to communicate something that's urgent and pressing to a wider public. So I do agree that there is a need for a much deeper self-reflection within scientists about the sorts of language and the sorts of devices that they are using in order to communicate.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to take a very brief comment from Joe and then out to the audience. Do we have microphones for the audience? Yeah, great. Okay, Joe.
Yeah, I want to draw attention really to draw out one of the points that Hans made about the need for scientists to reflect about the sorts of influences that come at them from society. I mean, I think obviously scientists have a lot of great useful expertise, but I think this is a very useful point to reflect upon. And I think one of the points that bears emphasis is the sorts of questions that tend to be avoided by the process of hiding behind the science, is the idea that human activity in the world is something that is potentially creative and problem-solving, and is something that is expansive rather than kind of something that just tells us need to kind of cut back and what human beings kind of always going to generate more problems and so forth. And I think that's the kind of wider social agenda that we have to begin to look at, explore what's behind that, and understand the influence of this on the scientific community. That's kind of one component of it, and why it is that that kind of approach leads to a hiding behind science, leads to a hiding behind the idea that this is the way the world is. There's nothing we can do about it. Science kind of lends itself very easily to that sort of message that the world is fixed, not something that human beings change.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Right, I'm going to get you all in. I'm going to do my best, yeah. Right, first of all, I'm going to take Professor Farady there, and then if we can pass the microphone. How many microphones have we got? Just the one? Okay. Oh, okay, right. Who over this side wants to speak?
Not me,
Right, this guy here in the middle. Thanks. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I used to accept the model of the inarticulate, clumsy scientist being distorted and caricatured by the media, and that was the way that it was presented. That we got all these nice, kind of very carefully worked out ideas, which are then distorted by the media. And it isn't just simply scientists who say that, because social scientists like myself, sociologists, and all academics usually protest that they were misquoted, misrepresented, and all the rest of that. And it's not really our fault, it's somebody else's fault. Except for a couple of things. The more I look at it, the more I realize that actually scientists do bear a disproportionate percentage of responsibility for what is out there. It's not something that is taken entirely out of their hands. I'm always struck by the fact that some of the best-selling authors in the non-fiction world in Britain happen to be all of a sudden these very articulate scientists who are able to write books that everybody wants to buy. And all of a sudden these very awkward individuals who can barely sort of pronounce the word science, sort of are able to sort of have this eloquent impact on the rest of the world. I also noticed, and you mentioned, Chris, in particular, that since the Tory government introduced the need to communicate your research in the public domain, that all academics, in fact, are very much focused on media training. And they understand that if they're going to make a move on in their career, they're going to have to become quite at ease with the outside world. And I also know that these days, for example, when you do a piece of research, as you're finishing your research, the press release that you're going to put out is already in your mind. You already know what the story is that you want to see happening, going to take place. I also know, and I think we all know, for example, that peer-reviewed journals or journals like The Lancet, essentially are press agencies, and from they have a very clear press agenda from a very early point onwards. They know exactly which kind of medical or scientific correspondents they want to contact, how they want the story to be framed, and in particular, they also know that they want the Lancet, for example, if the Lancet editor to be in the headline, not somebody else. And I think a lot of scientific journalists and scientific editors and research institutions are very much in the business of that. So the point I'm trying to make is that the dividing line between the world of science and the public domain is a very porous one, and probably is becoming more and more porous all the time. And that in the end, I think we have to take responsibility for the fact that the discussion on science in our society is not entirely, but to a significant measure, the responsibility of the language and the culture that scientists themselves have internalized over the years.
Thanks very much, Chris. You can't come back directly because there's so many people who want to speak. So you're here, and then can I see over this side? Right, there's a lady there. Please. See the microphone too? Yeah.
I'd like to know if it's possible to square the points that Hans van Storch was making against Joe Kaplinsky, which was that if scientists have got to be very careful about not speaking beyond their specialism, and at the same time not hide behind the science, and should participate in making proper suggestions as to what should be done, then it does seem that any assessment of what the proper risks are, in the way that Chris Rapley was talking about, if you were to consider, for example, is it a 1 in 100 chance that the Thames Barrier will be overwhelmed within a given time period? That's obviously a realistic question that should be considered by policymakers in terms of whether spending should be allocated to strengthen it. Now, I don't quite get the idea that if scientists aren't going to participate in the framing of these policy decisions, then who will?
Okay, thank you very much. So that lady there, and then if we could have that microphone down to the front, please.
My name is Sonja Böhmer Christensen. I know quite a few people up there. I publish a journal which still, publishes a few climate skeptics, and I will still defend some of them as not being entirely amateurs. But what I really wanted to say, and this really goes to the Tyndall Centre, this whole debate started in the late 80s, and I've followed it since then. It's taken the Tyndall Centre a very long time to speak out against the Kyoto Protocol. I and an Australian colleague, we published a book, a big book, well documented, in 2002, called Interests in the Failure of the Kyoto Process. did I get a question from any British university or from the Tyndall Centre to talk about the book? It was very badly, it wasn't reviewed in this country. So I'm saying there has been a silence for almost 10 years, if not longer, on this issue. And it's taken them a long time. And this whitewashing just won't work at the moment, because a lot of this, as Fred just said. But what I really wanted to tell the audience is either it's ignorance or it's self-interest of the scientific community, particularly the climate modelers and the Hadley Center people, using the IPCC and the name of the IPCC. I just want to make sure that our scientists know, that you know, the IPCC serves, gains a lot of its justification and indirect financing from the United Nations Treaty on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and from the Kyoto Protocol. If you look at the science and definitions of these legal treaties, there is no big scientific debate anymore. Human causation is assumed, danger is assumed, and the culprit, the responsibility of too much carbon dioxide and the fossil fuels is assumed. It's all laid down by law, and the IPCC and the huge scientific community have then been used by government bodies, by UNEP, to provide selectively the justification for this man-made dangerous fossil fuel, primarily fossil fuel related. So the scientific community didn't really have a real chance to discuss the science widely. They were used through the climate models pushed in one direction, putting all the blame, or most of the blame, on greenhouse gases. There is a wider scientific debate out there, and I do disagree very strongly, because it's my research area with Hans, that they're all amateurs. There are some good scientists out there, but they're not climate modelers on the whole. They tend to be geologists, they tend to be from the study of radiation physics, or solar people, or astrophysicists. There are counter-hypotheses there to the man-made dangerous global warming hypothesis, which are not part of the debate and are not encouraged by the climate modelers to participate in the debate.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so there's a gentleman here at the front, and then please, if you can pass it to Thomas Dykeman. And let's just see hands. Yeah, okay, great.
Okay. What about the absence which was mentioned by Sonia from Astronomer?
You mean you want to speak? I'm going to try and get everybody in. Yeah, at the front.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for organising this event and for all the speakers. I have a few points in which I wanted to bring up. I will try and be as quick as I can to get through all of them.
All right. Yeah, do them quickly if you're going to do more than one.
Yes, yes. The lack of legitimacy that I think has been voiced through the whole panel about the sort of exaggerated circumstances that's presented in the media, the arguments that seem to be closed to all borders, so that certain points of view are often portrayed in the media as being the way, the scientific evidence is backing it, all in this. The argument that was made about the 100, the chance of 100 to 1 or something like that, seems to follow the logic that opinion is not necessarily an unjustified opinion. The lack of concrete understanding about what might happen with climatic change, or through subsystems and systems of feedback loops and all of those arguments that are presented about these, the effects of runaway climate change, the effect that this anthropocentric causes of climatic change at the moment might actually be overtaken by natural processes within the planet. Those are arguments that aren't necessarily addressed in the media as much, but their opinion seems to voice that logical argument there, that is a possibility that might happen. So is it necessarily an unjustified opinion to say that there is a worst case scenario possible? And I'd also, yeah, I'll try and be as quick as I can. The pragmatic assumptions of science as to what the outcomes, the possible solutions to these problems, whether it be technological or through social structures, it requires an understanding, doesn't it, of a social scientist's point of view, an understanding of social theory, understanding of social modelling in ways that which address very political arguments about individualism, about communalism, and all these arguments. So I don't see why it's difficult for scientists to stand up and say, well, actually, we're joining, for once, I think in quite a historical way, the combinations of these hard scientists, or traditional scientists, and what have progressed through the 20th century has been more social scientists, and using different areas of knowledge to address what is a global and a multi-interrelated problem, whether it be through politics or economics or any of the different levels of human existence. And
okay. Sorry to cut you off, okay? Yeah. I think you made that point very well, and actually, because a lot of the questions so far have been in a particular direction, and Chris, actually, a lot of people have seen what's been going on as very, very positive. And so I think that's a very valid point to address. Right, Thomas Dijkman, then the gentleman in that cap there, please, if we can pass the microphone to him. I will keep being pithy.
Thank you. Well, I'm a science journalist and a science writer and an editor of a magazine which deals with all these issues systematically. And I could pass it on to my sub-editor, the problem, but actually I think I'm more interested in these political trends which we have discussed. And following from what Professor Ferridi said, I really think it's time for the science community to act on these political trends. That actually what happens is that politics is seeking for external authority, what Joe alluded to, through scientific voices. Because what happens really, and I can talk about myself and I talk about a lot of colleagues, that actually science is losing out its credibility in society. It's the first time in my career, I must say, as a science journalist, I don't trust any report anymore that's out on climate change. I can't trust the IPCC anymore because it's so highly politicized and involved in political strategies that I found it hardly difficult to come up with a conclusion as a journalist who's trying to get out the truth. And I think it's really time to start a proper discussion in the science community, because we are now discussing climate change, but the trend is not new. It's a trend which is ongoing for the last 10, 15 years. We had a very good satellite event 2 days ago. We were talking about bioethics, with ethics committees in biomeds, in all that aspect. It's the same trend, actually, that policy is taken away by taking political responsibility and putting scientists into position to declare the world and come up with solutions. I think, honestly, that is my biggest frustration as a science writer. There's no discussion, at least in public, about how scientists are going to deal with that. And to be quite honest about that, von Storch, you're going to know what is the situation in Germany. We've got two media stars, Mr. Schellenhuber and his colleague, Mr. Rahmsdorf, who scare the people in Germany, who are big partners of our Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, and other scientists don't appear anymore. Oh, no. And these people are really part of I think, a problematic campaign, smearing as well colleagues, including myself, just by raising questions. And I wait for the day really the science community is waking up in order to defend actually the values it can provide to society.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, this gentleman here, then I'll bring the speakers back for brief comments, then get the rest of you in. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I'm not a scientist, but I'd like to ask the panel, do they consider Michael Fish as being the first climate change casualty? But more seriously, I think it was mentioned earlier on, the question of social equity and or social inequity, sorry. Isn't there a model through medicine where scientists has engaged with society on issues of social problems? And actually, climate change as a proxy for sorting out some of those social problems, that doesn't seem too bad, really, does it? An excuse? That's all, really.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, speakers, brief responses to any points. Hans.
This point with the Thames, you asked for this is exactly the statement which we would make. The chances that this may happen now is 1 in 100. I'm not sure what the number is. And this may change 2 in 100 in 30, 40 years or so. But we would not say then immediately, and you're not supposed to build new large amounts of houses right behind the dam or so. But that would be the political conclusion, or to build a new one. But to assess the risk and the changing risk, that's what we would do. And I think in that case we have no problem with each other. I think that's what you asked, right?
Kind of. But I mean, given that the science itself is in dispute and the whole calculation of what the risk is, and that's so loaded in terms of the conclusions that you draw, the idea that scientists will be able to stay out of that debate and just present the science, I find that quite difficult to...
I mean, this is a standard thing what we often do in Germany, because, I mean, coastal defense is exactly what we're talking about. So what we communicate is that we would say that the coastal defense for the time being is safe. I mean, if it's safe, then it will continue to be safe for another 20 years or so. We should start a general discussion of how to deal with these possibly changing dangers we expect. And our best guess for the time being is that there will be an increase of the risk by blah, blah, blah. But that it may very well be that we have to revise this assessment in 10 years.
Okay, thanks. Mike?
I mean, just a point on that is that, I mean, different cultures, different societies have different ways of bringing science to bear on policy debate. I mean, what happens in Germany is different from what happens in the UK, from what happens in the United States, and again, different from what happens in China. So the idea that there is simply this enterprise called science and this process called policy, and there's one way that they interact, is actually not the case at all. Each country is very, very different. And I think just one other observation I'd make, and picking up on 2 or 3 of the comments, suggests to me that people still have some instinctive preference to view science as this totally objective, impartial searcher for the truth. That is not the nature of much contemporary science. And people who I mean, two of the commentators just now actually referred specifically to, where do I go to find the truth? Science, as many of the recent insights that coming through sociology of scientific knowledge and science and technology studies show, science is a deeply embedded social and cultural practice, and to pretend that there is some objective truth, universal truth out there to be discovered is not the way I personally would see the role of science in society. What my arguments at the very beginning were is that we need to make that very, very explicit. So when people say, well, 2 degrees of global warming, scientists say that 2 degrees of global warming is necessary to avoid catastrophic climate change, that has come through a scientific process, but embedded in that whole process are a whole variety of value judgments, subjective interpretations that have reached that stage, and it should not be presented to society as the truth that science has somehow found out there. It is not out there.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Joe, and then Chris. Okay. As quickly as you can.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think I agree more or less with what Mike just said about when you look at these new sorts of truths about is 2 degrees dangerous. Clearly there's not a truth out there waiting to be discovered. There's can society develop and respond to the world and change the world and so forth. You know, I hope he's not abandoning the idea of science, at least as a seeker, rather than a deliverer of truths in a narrower sphere, but that's another discussion perhaps. What I just wanted to pick up on briefly was the reference that Chris made earlier to the Stern report and the kind of sigh of relief that scientists breathed when it came out, and in relation to some of the points being made about scientists taking responsibility for things. Because I mean, I think it wasn't just scientists. A lot of people breathed a sigh of relief when Stern came out. You found all these kind of, because now Stern has said this, now we kind of know, and so forth. And you know, I think that it's not really that much of a step forward, because you can see there's a kind of similar model of the expert kind of being able to make the decision for us all, more the economist, and you can see the model of kind of Gordon Brown, who then Chancellor, kind of commissioned that report in a similar kind of style, a kind of technocratic style of politics, just he kind of made the Bank of England independent, kind of get the politics out of it. He kind of commissioned this review. And the second problem with it, when you look at Stern, of course, is Stern says, well, of course, everything's based on the science, you know. But then when you read it a bit more closely, it's all about how, well, of course, the kind of newer science is kind of telling us it's all much more catastrophic. We have to kind of look at the worst case scenarios and so on. So all this is kind of smuggled in. You know, not to go into all the problems with Stern, but just to kind of give you one example of the kind of bizarrely kind of fixed static view in Stern and this vision of the truth about the future. You look at the figure of 5 to 20% of GDP, supposedly the kind of damage that we're giving up. He kind of adds up the damage over the whole kind of future history. And, you know, more than half of that figure comes from years after the year 2800, right? Yeah, he has this vision of kind of, say, centuries into the future. You think, like, you know, this kind of incredible sense of being able to kind of project forward this truth about the world and about how we will respond to it. So, you know, Stern, so far as I can see, is just kind of variation on the kind of scientized version of this discussion, and is not going to help us.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, a number of points. On Stern, the sigh of relief was not because he got it right, but because the locus of the argument had shifted out of the remit of the academic science community into the more general role of decision making. And there are decision makers out there. So we vote for people to act as our representatives and make decisions. I think the science community was feeling deeply uncomfortable with this debate residing entirely in its field. So as I understand it, the big argument about Stern was more to do with discount rates and how much you value the future. And that's fine. Those are the sorts of people who should be having that debate. And it's unfinished, I imagine. It's not my expertise. On Michael Fish, actually, he wasn't really a casualty. Other than the Blue Peter elephant, I can't think of anybody from the 1980s who's still in our minds. So he's quite a celebrity. And of course, it can't be attributed to climate change because no single event, even as extreme as the 1987, you know my argument there. Very quickly on the inarticulate scientists, that wasn't what I was saying. What I was saying was the science community is still learning how to do this new thing of science and society. And of course, young scientists these days are being taught about the importance of getting their message out in society, having dialogue. But I'll bet you that there were hundreds of press releases last week. You'll see a subset of them reported in New Scientist. But which ones got into the daily newspapers? The fact that CO2 is increasing 35% faster than people had predicted, and this big report from the UN. So there is a filter. There is something going on there. Which is more than the science community can control. It shouldn't control it, but it's more than it knows really how to handle to its benefit. Thank you.
And the deference to something like the Stern report, the IPCC, is kind of the wrong way around. Maybe it's the fact that science has become politicised is actually giving scientists a reason to do what they do. And they're quite comfortable with that in the main, and letting that process deliver them to politics, which is obviously distorting the impact that science has. I mean, science for its own sake, in terms of climate science, is just an impossibility at the moment. Is that not the case?
Okay, thank you very much. Nice and pithy. Yeah, at the back.
Yes. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. One of the interesting things, if you look at debates within environmentalism in the United States in particular over the past 10 years, is there's been a very searching debate over why they have somehow failed to convince the majority of the urgency of responding to climate change. And one of the interesting things in this debate is that there's been a shift from saying, well, we can convince most people simply can't understand it, or they're too interested in driving their SUVs and they don't really care about the future. And pretty soon by the end of it, what happens is we just can't trust most people to make the decisions and be involved in it, which is why there's a shift away from making democratic arguments and appealing to people's reason and making the political argument up front, to shifting to undemocratic sources of authority, including hiding behind the science. And one of the questioners before said, well, why is that so bad? Well, maybe it's good. Well, because it doesn't go. You're not just getting what you want. You've also changed your political views. I mean, it's very marked within the environmental movement how deeply undemocratically they view most people in the United States.
Okay, thanks. There's a gentleman in a green shirt in the middle here, and then I'm going to take this man here. Yeah, go on in. And then this lady in the white top, and that, I'm afraid, will be it. Yeah, with this gentleman here in the middle with the green shirt. Yeah.
Okay, good. Picking up points from David Perks and another on the panel, Hans there. Scientists have been very good at getting politicians to spend money on big science, gazillions on CERN, for example, which, if we're lucky, we'll find a Higgs boson, and that will have, as far as I can tell, and I started out as a physicist, no effect on anything for at least 100 years. So why aren't you guys lobbying to build a heat exchanger the size of Manhattan in the middle of the Atlantic? I don't know if that's good science, by the way, but, you know, these guys can be persuaded. And what they're doing, if you don't do that, is follow a behaviorist agenda. They'll fund climate modelers and use it as an excuse for changing our behavior. And I don't want that.
Okay, thank you very much. This gentleman over here in the blue shirt, this lady in the white top, and then I'm very sorry, but that will be it, and then we'll have final comments from the speakers.
Piers Corbyn from Weather Action Long Range Weather Forecasters.
Yeah, no adverts, please.
Okay, weatheraction.com, I didn't say that. I'm a militant campaigner for the integrity in science. And I believe that the prove and predict norms of the rest of science should be applied to climate science, which has now reached a level of falsity and absence of integrity unparalleled since the 1930s. And specifically, the problem we have is, first of all, there is no evidence that carbon dioxide has ever had a net control of world temperatures or climate change. And there's no evidence that anything special is happening now in weather or climate, which hasn't happened before. And the problem we have is that despite that peer-reviewed information, we have all events of the weather on TV are essentially, if they're anything extreme, they're classified as proof of climate change. And very specifically, I'll give you a warning. There's been some storms in the western north last night. These were predicted using solar activity by us last December. And there are going to be 2 more big storms, bigger ones, on the 8th to 13th of November and the 24th to 28th of November. Now, you can be sure that Messrs. Hulme and Rapley will be jumping up and down saying more evidence of climate change. And the TV will say the same, but I want you to write them down and just get ready and prepare, of course, to batten down the hatches.
And quickly...
The final point is, I'm against pollution and say I'm for saving the planet, but not where the planet doesn't need to be saved. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, and the climate change science is a political game, not a scientific game. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This lady here.
Actually, the points I was going to make actually lead on directly from the last 2 points. The first one is that, well, I came to this debate, I'm not a scientist, I'm a teacher, that this is about science and the politics of climate change. We haven't actually heard enough about the politics, and as the chap at the back was saying, there is an awful lot of funding that obviously goes towards scientists from politicians. And you've already talked about how difficult it is to communicate with the media. Well, there's also an element of the media being governed very much by politicians, and how easy is it for scientists to communicate with politicians, and where is it you get your funding from, and what is a politically hot thing to do. And what I was going to say directly leading on from a point that I think Hans was saying was really it's politically hot at the moment to be discussing climate change, but is it also politically hot, and is it actually contradictory, for example, to be spending money on third world development, which might also encourage climate change, etc., if you industrialise the third world. Well, the other thing I was going to actually point out is a lot of our evidence for climate change is directly as a result of what scientists have been able to measure in perhaps the last 100, 150 years. So we keep hearing about, well, this is since records began the hottest summer, or the hottest or the wettest summer for the last 50 years. Well, what was happening 500 years before that? What was happening 1,000 years before that? What evidence do we have for climate fluctuation and the effect it's had, before that? As a scientist, I don't know. You might be able to tell me.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, thank you to all of you. Sorry not to get you all in. Speakers, your final parting thoughts, please. Just parting thoughts. Mike.
Well, I'll simply come back to one of the points I made at the beginning, and that is that the real issues that need to be debated in society are issues around what future do we want for nuclear energy. They are around questions about what sort of population policy is appropriate in our country and in our world. They're questions about, do we really believe in the Millennial Development Goals, which are set for the year 2015, or do we not? They're questions around what sort of vehicles in the medium to long-term future do we want to be driving around, and what is the role of the state in protecting citizens against flooding. Now, those are legitimate policy and political debates that should be had under the heading of climate change, but we shouldn't stitch them all together into this monolithic problem that science pronounces what the goal is, and we assume that society has to be bullied into a particular course of action in following of that. We should have those debates. Climate change opens up all of those debates and the legitimate debates for all agencies and individuals in society to participate in.
Okay, thanks. Chris?
I think I'll just focus on scientific truth. Mike was saying that it was questioning whether there is such a thing as scientific truth. I think that at the core there is scientific measurement, and those measurements are the start of a foundation. So, for example, we were asked, how do we know what happened before measurements began? We've made temperature measurements. We've made temperature measurements for 150 years, carbon dioxide measurements for the last 40, 50 years. And you can argue about whether they've been done right or wrong, and you can come to some conclusions about how big the error bars are, because any scientist will say no value of a quantity is worth anything unless you've got a proper set of error bars and uncertainties on it. When it goes to what happened before, there are some ways that you can peer back into the past. You can make direct measurements of things in ice cores that go back a million years. You can interpret other data that go back millions of years. There's much larger uncertainty then because you're using proxy measures. But that's the basic foundation of what I would call, whether it's the right use or the wrong use of the word, that's the basic truth that the scientists start from. We measured these things. We can interpret them in unified ways which allow us, we believe, to predict the future, and that's I agree with that. That's an important point, because then you test whether you've got things right. And I know that the climate models come in for a lot of flack. I'm certainly marginally sceptical about many of the comments that are made from the numerical models, because the Earth is such a complex system, we are not simulating it. However, they can be a useful tool in trying to see whether we understand how the system works or not. That too is a sort of truth.
Okay, thanks. Hans?
I would say climate change research, or climate research, is in general in good shape, if we just speak about what we do among us. But nowadays we have the problem that whenever we have an exciting result, which we would normally just put forward as a hypothesis, this could be this, it could be that, or so, is immediately brought into the public arena. Yes, sure. So we scientists suffer from too much attention. We no longer have the opportunity to discuss strange ideas and find out after 5 years of discussion, this was unfortunately not entirely correct.
I agree.
Which is all the time the case. So we have the right to err. And we do not make progress without erring, without trying things out. And that's why we have the peer review process, that other people look over our shoulders and then they repeat it. But we do not have that so much in climate science, because it is immediately brought into the attention. Somebody spoke about the landslide or so, that it would be in a press agency. It's immediately brought to the attention of everybody, and it's in the limelight. And so I would ask the public, please let us just have a grace period of 5 years of just doing a little bit of fun science and err and make errors and do whatever we want, and after 5 years we come back and then we report about what has happened in the past.
Okay.
And if I may ask something else, I mean, I really appreciate that nobody mentioned the war.
Very good. Not yet. Final word to Joe Kaplinsky.
Yeah, I won't remind you of Al Gore's remarks on that score, which I alluded to earlier. Sadly, society as a whole is clearly obsessed with global warming. I was just thinking over my final remarks here and happened to look down at the bottle of water. Stop global warming, it says. It's everywhere. Yeah.
Is it on here?
And no one is immune to this, and it's just become a kind of part of everyday life for more or less everybody. And scientists know less, I think, than anyone else. And you can find both scientists working specifically on climate. You can find more or less any other kind of scientist will find a climate angle or a clean energy angle to the kind of technology and the work. For more or less everyone in the world, fighting climate change, stopping climate has become something that we do and part of our motivations and so forth. And I think that this is a large part of the problem. To sum up, I would just kind of use the example of Al Gore again, his supposed generational mission to kind of reduce CO2 emissions, and just stop to ask yourself, well, let's suppose we succeeded on this generational mission. You know, how would the world be changed? And the answer is that the world would be absolutely no better than it is today. You know, everything would be just the same. The kind of height of aspiration that you can possibly come up with is, well, let's just stop things falling apart. And I would suggest that what we need to do is find a much bigger and greater generational mission to inspire us. And until we do that, scientists are going to miss a lot of opportunities, and so are the rest of us.
Okay, thank you to all our speakers.